Hi, in this video I'm gonna create the foundation of our unit training. So to start we need to do something similar to our buildings and create proper database tables and scripts and classes. So let's go to the script, and here I'm gonna create a script and name it unit. Now let's open this unit and I'm gonna add the namespace. Now let's go and create another script. Here in the UI we're gonna create a script called UI unit, and let's also open this unit and add the namespace here as well. Of course you don't have to add a namespace if you don't want to. And finally let's go to the data script and open that up. Here also we need to create a class for our units, so let's create it right here. Gonna just say public class unit, and we could also create an enum for our units, so this is gonna be enum unit ID. So let's say barbarian and archer for now. So this is gonna be public unit ID. This is gonna be the level, and we also need a database ID for our units, so it's gonna be a long. Let's also create an integer and name it housing. Of course there is other variables like health, damage and other stuff. I'm just gonna leave it for now. Let's go and create the basics first. Here in the player class I am just going to copy this, and this is going to be unit, and this is going to be our units script. So now we have a list of our buildings and a list of our units in our player class. And of course we need to apply these changes to our server data class as well. So let me just copy from player to unit. Just gonna copy that, and let's go to the server here in the data. I'm gonna paste it instead of this. Now we could go to our database and start creating the necessary tables. So I'm gonna create the first table and name it units. I'm gonna create 7 columns. So the first one is going to be ID, the second one is going to be global ID, the other one is going to be level, and this is going to be account ID, this is going to be terrain, this is going to be ready, and the last one is going to be terrain time. So right here the first one is going to be an auto increasement. Let's get here and check this box. So let's take care of the other ones as well. This is going to be a varchar. Let's say the length is 50 and by default it's empty. The level is going to be an integer and by default it's 1. Account ID is also going to be an integer. Terrain is going to be an integer. The length of it is going to be 1 and by default it's 0. Ready is going to be the same thing. Length is 1 and by default is 0. And terrain time, it's going to be a float and by default it's 0. Now let's create this. So this is our units script. Let's go back to our database, create another database. This is going to be server units. Let's create 10 columns. The first one is ID, the second one is global ID, the other one is level. This is going to be required gold, the other one is going to be required elixir, and the other one is going to be required gems. This is going to be required dark elixir, and let's make this one terrain time. Also we could add health and housing here. So housing is an integer by default. Let's say it's 1. Health, let's say it's 10 by default. Terrain time, let's say it's 0 by default. The other ones also, let's put 0. And let's go to the level. By default it's 1. And global ID is going to be a varchar 50. By default it's empty. And of course we need to make the ID auto increasement. Let's scroll horizontally to make the checkbox visible. Here it is, AI or auto increasement checkbox. So let's create it. So now here in the server units, let's actually insert values. So let's say barbarian, and level 1, let's say it requires 10 elixirs, and the terrain time for it is 5 seconds. So let's say go, and let's insert another one, and this one is going to be archer, and let's say it takes 20 elixirs, and terrain time for this is 10 seconds. Let's hit go. Now if we go to the browse of our server units, you'll see that we have 2 server units. Now let's go to our client, and here in the canvas I'm going to duplicate this shop, and let's name this terrain. So I'm gonna remove the UI shop from here, and instead going to UI and add another UI which we are going to create. Let's create it. This is going to be UI terrain. Now let's open this up, and let's add the namespace. Now let's go back and attach it to our terrain panel. I'm gonna open the UI shop and copy everything from here, because we're gonna be using exactly something like that. Here in terrain I'm gonna paste it, and let's check this out. We need to add the using Unity engine.ui, and this is going to be UI terrain, the same thing here. And let's just rename this to close instead of close shop. And if we go back here, we'll see that we have a bunch of variables we need to assign. That's our elements. Let me enable this. And we also have the close button. We're gonna assign that as well. Now this is going to be our units, and I'm gonna expand this. Let's remove all of them and just leave this one, and I'm gonna remove that UI building, and instead of that I'm gonna add a UI unit. Let's open this up. So we need to do something like UI building. I'm gonna copy everything from there. Let's copy that and paste it here in our UI unit. Okay, we also need to add the namespace for it. Let's just copy it from our UI building. So I'm gonna copy the namespace, and instead of this building ID, this is going to be unit ID, and instead of this building prefab, well, we're gonna handle the unit training completely different than this. So I'm just gonna clear this, and let's save this. And let's go back to the UI. Here it is. Let's rename this to Barbarian and also change the text for it. Let me open some space. This is going to be Barbarian, and we also need to change the ID for it. Yes, it is changed, and that is going to be the button. We could also add the number of units we have, so I'm just gonna copy that and let's paste it here. This is gonna be have count, and let's go to the 2D view. Let's bring it down here, and for now I'm just gonna put 0 on it. And also let's get down here, and here in the extra settings I'm gonna uncheck raycast target. Well, let's do that for this button here as well. I'm gonna uncheck raycast target, so that should take care of that. Also in this UI unit we can create a reference to our text. So let's say using text mesh pro, and I'm just gonna copy that, and this is going to be text mesh pro, and this is going to be have units. And let's go and assign this as well. Here it is. So that's our Barbarian. I'm just gonna duplicate that. Let's name this Archer, and this is going to be Archer. Well, actually we should parent this have count to our button, and here I'm gonna change the ID to Archer. Let's do the same thing for our Barbarian. I'm gonna parent that to the button, and let's check this out. This is our units area. I'm just going to bring it a little down and change the size. So for the Barbarian and the Archer, let's say 300, and we could also change the location of this text. Of course the UI definitely needs to change, but for now we're just gonna use like this, and that is our units. We also need an area for our training units, so let's say training units, and this training units, let's bring it up here, and let's set these to 0. And we would also need a script for our training units, so let's say UI units training. So I'm gonna open that up. Let's add the namespace, and for now I'm just gonna leave it empty. And let's go back here under training units. Let's create a prefab for it. Let me just delete that. This is going to be unit training, and I'm gonna remove that, assign this, and let's see what we have. I'm going to remove this button. So this is going to be background. It's going to be title. So let's name this title, and this is going to be count. Of course we need to change the title later, and we're gonna use an icon for every unit, but for now let's just use title. And here in my prefabs I am going to drag this unit training here, And let's also create the variables. Something like we did here in the unit. So I'm just gonna copy that using TM Pro, and let's bring a text. This is going to be title text, and I'm gonna create another one. This is going to be count text, and here in the UI train I am just going to create the prefab, which is going to be UI units training. So this is going to be train prefab, and also let's create a transform, and this is going to be train grid. And now let's go and assign these values. First I'm gonna start with this prefab. I'm gonna assign the title and count. Let's apply the changes. I'm just gonna delete that. Here in the train game object we have train prefab and train grid. This is going to be the grid, and the prefab, here it is in the prefabs unit training. So now let's go and hide the elements. So if you remember, here in the camera controller we assigned the onClick event of our buttons. So now let's get down here and add another else if here. Let's say else if it is the train button. In that case, for now let's just say UI train dot instance dot set status true, and let's go ahead and see how this works. I'm gonna start the server, and now let's play the game. Now if we select our barracks and hit train, it's gonna open the train panel for us. We can start training as many units as we want, and now we could handle the event on these buttons. Now here in the server project, let's go to the database, and here in the sync player data we also need to return the units data as well. To do that we need to create something similar to this get building async. Let's go to the definition and let me open this up. Here it is. So to do this I am just gonna copy all of that and let's paste it all down here, and I'm gonna say get units. It takes an account ID and also takes a MySQL connection, and it's not gonna be of type async, and it's just gonna return a list of data.unit. And let's see, let's cut all of that and remove the task, paste it here. So we're just gonna say this is a list of units, and we also don't need a connection, so let's remove the connection area, and let's remove that as well. So it's gonna be select units.id and units.global ID, also units.level. Well, I think that's all for our units. So let's go to the server units. We have required gold, elixir, gem, dark elixir, train time, health, and housing. Let's get those as well. But before that, let's say units dot trained units ready and units trained time. Well, I think that was all of the columns that we needed. So up until, let's say, here, I'm just gonna delete that, and it's gonna be from units left join server units on units.global ID equals to server units.global ID and units.level equals to server units.level, where units account ID equals to that. So let's get back here before the left join. We're gonna select those from units, but we also need the few records from server units. Let's say server units dot health, train time, and housing. So those values, we're gonna get those values, and this is going to be unit, the same thing here, unit. And now let's parse this value. Let's say enum dot parse. So the type is going to be data unit ID, and let's say type of unit ID, and this is going to be cast into data dot unit ID. Well, here in data we could also add a bunch of other variables to our unit. So let's start with public bool trained and public bool ready, public int health, and public int train time. And also let's add another public int, and this is going to be trained time. Now let's copy this unit class for our client as well. Let me just close a bunch of these classes. Here in the data, I'm gonna replace it with this unit. And let's go back to the server project. Here in the database, we need to add the other variables. The ID is going to be the database ID. We have the level, we have the health here, so let's just remove those. And we could remove that and use this, say is true, and this is going to be is true. This is going to be trained, and this is going to be trained equals to is true greater than 0. I am just going to do something like this for ready, and we don't need to define it as an integer, it's already been defined, and this is going to be ready. We could also create another for our housing, and let's create a float for our trained time. So this is going to be float, and this is going to be trained time. Well, here in the data it needs to be a float. The same thing on the client, let's make it float. And here in the server, let's go back to database. Well, this is still, we need to change the other one to the float. This is still an integer. same thing here. And here in the database, we don't have an error anymore. We also need a reference for our train time, which is an integer, and it's gonna be train time. So let me readjust these and also rename this from building to unit. Now if we call this, it's gonna return a values for us, but it's not async. So to fix that problem, let's create a task for it. I'm just gonna take a copy of that, paste it here, and let's collapse that. This is going to be get units async. So that is that. It takes an account ID. It will return a list of data units. So let me just copy that, paste it for here, and I'm going to create a MySQL connection, and let's remove the other stuff. And here I am going to define a list called units equals to new list of units, and units equals to get units. I'm going to pass the account ID and the connection, and at the end I'm going to return the units. So we have get units async and also get units. We can use them based on our need. So let's get up there, and in the sync player data, we are going to do something similar. This is going to be a list of units. It's gonna be units, and this is going to be get units async player dot units equals to units. So from now on, whenever we sync the data, the list of units is going to be returned as well, and we can access that list here in the client player and here in the receive packet. Well, actually here in the sync data, we can just access it using player.units. So after we looped through buildings, we could also loop through our units as well. So let's say for player.units.count, then we're gonna do whatever we want in here. And let's create another function just in case we want immediate sync with the server. I'm gonna name it rush sync request, and in this I'm gonna set the timer equals to 0, and we need to make a few changes in our update function. So let's go up here, and here I'm gonna create another boolean. Let's just copy this, and this is gonna be updating, and let's find all the references to this connected. So here in the receive packet, whenever we have an auth, we're gonna set the updating to true, and here in the sync we're gonna set the updating equals to false. And let's get up here. In this case we're gonna say if timer is less or equal than 0, and I'm gonna create a private float sync time, and this is going to be timer minus equal than that, and here updating is going to be true, and of course timer equals to sync time. Now while we are here, let's create a couple of more requests. The first one is going to be train and equals to 9, and the other one is going to be cancel train, and it is going to be index of 10. Let's just copy this and paste it for our server here in the terminal. In the data, I'm just gonna paste it here. So now we have two more request IDs and we can use them now. And let's go to our client. Here, let's actually call that rush sync request here in the place successfully. Instead of that, we're gonna say rush sync request. And I'm just gonna copy that. Let's get down here. We're gonna do the same thing in the replace successful. Let's get further down here, and the upgrade is started. We're gonna do that. The same thing here in the instant build. We're gonna rush the sync request. So basically, whenever we make a change on the server, we want the client to sync immediately to update itself and receive the changes. And now let's go to the UI unit and send the packet when we click on a specific unit to be trained. Well, I decided from now on I'll try to write the code before I start recording the video, and when I start recording I'm gonna copy and paste the code that I've already written, because writing the code is just time consuming and it's kind of boring. So let me go to my desktop. Here I have prepared a script, so let me open that. Here it is, Clash Part 21 draft. So I'm going to be using these codes, and every time I am going to just copy and paste this code and explain what they do, of course. So let's start by UI unit. So I'm going to open this. This is a code I've already written. So to start, let's go to the collect event. I'm just going to copy that. Let's go to the UI terrain. Well, actually here in the UI unit, let me paste it. So I am going to create a new packet. I'm going to write the ID of that packet, and I'm going to also write the ID of that unit, which is either a barbarian, archer, or whatever. It's just going to write that, and that is going to be sent as a global ID of that unit. Then I'm going to send the package to the server. So let's go to the server and receive that package here in the terminal. I am just going here and create two more cases. That's one and that's twice. This is going to be terrain, and this is going to be cancel train. So for this terrain, we are receiving a string, and this is going to be global ID, and it's gonna be read a string. So let's go and create the necessary functions here in the database. So first I'm gonna collapse that here at the end of my database. Let's go and check out the draft I've created. Here up there I have created a function for it, train unit. I'm just gonna copy that train unit and train unit async that I've already written, and let's go and paste it in our server database. Of course, I'm gonna provide you with a link to download that draft, also with the source code of the complete project when I'm done, of course, so you can access that. So don't worry, you don't have to type this. So this is the train unit. It takes an ID, which is the client ID, and of course the global ID. Let's go to the terminal and call that. Here it is. It's gonna be a terrain unit, client ID, and of course the global ID. And here in the database, we're gonna create a new packet. We're gonna give the ID of terrain, and this is the account ID. We're gonna get that. Then we're gonna wait for train unit async to give us a response. Then we're gonna write that response and send it back to the client. So this train unit async is going to get an account ID, a level, and a global ID. The level I'm just gonna pass 1 for now. The global ID is the global ID of the unit that we want to train. Let's get down here. We need to go to the data and create a server unit class. So let's do that. Here it is in the data. Let's get down here, and I'm just gonna copy that, paste it here, and it is going to be server unit. So it is kind of like server building actually. So let me just copy it from here. I'm not gonna get the ID. So, and I'm gonna paste it over here. This is going to be terrain time. We don't have a gained XP. We don't have a rows and columns. And for now, let's just leave the rest of it. Let's go back to the database. The first thing, we're gonna create a integer. Let's just rename it to response. And then we're gonna create a connection, and the first thing we're gonna do, we're gonna get the server unit details. Let's go to the database here in the database server units table. If you remember, we've created 2 records. So if we want to train a barbarian level 1, we're gonna get this data like required gold, required elixir, gem, health, and other stuff. We're gonna get those values using this function. We haven't created this function yet, so let's go and create it. I am going to just copy it from here. Copy, and let's paste it right over here. So it is easy. We're gonna say get server units. It's gonna get a list of the server units. And the other one is going to be get server unit, which is only gonna get 1 unit. Okay, that's a list of them, and this is a specific one that we are just gonna use this. But here in the server units, we need a terrain time, we need a health and a housing. So let's go to the data. So I don't think we need a database ID, so let me just remove that, and this is going to be terrain time. And let me just copy that, place it twice. This is going to be health. And this is going to be housing. So let me copy the server unit and go to the client, paste it in the data. Let me find it here in the scripts, data. I'm just gonna paste it right here. So let's go back to the server, and here in the database, well, let's face this housing, and that should do it. The same thing here, housing. So it's basically going to select global ID, level, and other stuff from server units. It's just gonna select all of them whenever we call get server units. So we're gonna use that later, but for now we're just using this. We're gonna pass a global ID and a level, so it's gonna bring that specific server unit for us. So let me collapse that here in the train units async. Well, as I said, the first thing, we're gonna get the server unit, then we check if it's null or not. If it is null, we're gonna respond with the index of 3. So if it's not null, then we're gonna get a capacity, and the capacity is going to be get buildings by global ID. It's gonna get the barracks. So we're gonna pass the building ID of barracks. We're gonna get all the barracks actually. Then we're gonna loop through them, and we're gonna sum their capacity. That way we get how much capacity our barracks has. Then we're just gonna create an occupied integer, and then we're gonna select some of the server units that housing. So it's gonna check all the units that we have. So it's gonna select it from units, left join server units. It's gonna select all the units that we have, which there already is less or equal than 0. So basically all the units that has been started training, but they haven't been made ready yet. They're still on the train list, and it's gonna get all of them for this account ID, and it's gonna sum their housing, and it's gonna put it in the occupied. So here in the unit dot, let's fix this housing. If we have housing to train more units, then we're gonna do the rest of it. Otherwise, we're gonna respond with the index of 4, which means the capacity is full. If we have capacity, it's gonna spend the resources. Okay, if you don't have resources, it's gonna respond with number 2. If you have the resources, then it's gonna insert into units with this info, and it's gonna respond with 1. It's easy. If you are familiar with MySQL, it's very easy. You can learn it. Even if you're not familiar with it, it's very easy language. It's like talking. and this response will be returned and will be written into a packet and will be sent to the client with the train ID. So let me collapse this and go back to the client here in the client player, then receive the response we got. Well, let me see, here it is, packet received. Let me just copy this and paste it here. This is going to be terrain. Well, and this is going to be cancel train. So we haven't written the cancel train yet. So here in the train we are getting a response. Well, that is accurate. If it is 2, we have no resources. If it is 1, then we are successfully trained that unit. Well, actually the train just started. We have 2 more indexes. Let's say here and here. This is number 4 and number 3. If it is number 4, server unit not found, and if it is 3, we're gonna say no capacity. Of course, this is no barracks capacity. We have 2 capacities to consider. The first one is barracks capacity, when we can determine how much units we can train at the same time, and the second capacity is the army camp capacity, which determines how many units we have ready for battle. Now that is our train. So let's create the cancel train options here in the client. So the first thing, let's open the canvas here in the train. I am just gonna enable this. And let's go to the 2D view. Here in the training units, if you remember, we created a prefab for it. Let's go and drag that prefab here. We need to make a few changes. So let's open this up first and let's take a look at the draft. Here, UI units training. I'm just gonna copy this values first. So here we go. We need a text for the title. We need an image for the bar to determine how much of the training has remained. So first let's actually copy this and say using Unity Engine.UI. And we also need a button which whenever we want to cancel the training, we're gonna click on that. Then we need a data unit to save the unit details in that variable. And whenever we call public long database ID, we're just gonna return that. First, actually, we check if the unit is null or not. If it is not null, then we're gonna return database ID. Otherwise, we're just gonna return 0. We also need an ID, and it is an index. This index determines place of this UI units training here in the view. It's gonna be actually a list. It's gonna be multiple prefabs, and it's gonna determine the index of every prefab in that list. So let's go back here. Let's go back to the draft. Here in the start, let's copy actually everything and bring it here. I'm just gonna paste it and start from here. At the start, we're just gonna add the listener to our remove button, and this listener is going to be listening on this function. And let me add the namespace for using developers hub.realtime networking client up here. And now whenever this remove button is clicked, we're gonna send a packet to the server saying remove this unit from training list with this database ID. And let's comment this for now. And here in the initialize, whenever this initialize gets called, a unit is going to be passed. So whenever we instantiate this prefab, we're gonna call this initialize immediately. We're gonna set the fill amount to 0. We're gonna assign the unit that is being passed to this unit we have here. And we're gonna set the title text to unit id.toString. And here in the update, if we have a unit, which means this item has been instantiated, and if the index equals to 0, which means it is the first unit in the list, then we're gonna start changing the bar.fill amount. And if the timer reaches the time when the unit has been trained, we're just gonna remove this. Well, actually, we're not gonna use this because we don't want to cancel the train. We're just gonna use this. Let me just copy that and paste it here. Of course, it's commented now, but we're gonna write that later. But for now, let's just leave it. So let's go to the Unity editor. Here in the unit training prefab, we need to assign the values. Let's go here. Well, we don't need a count for this, so let me hide that. But we do need a title. Well, that has been assigned already. And we also need a bar. So let me create an image here, UI image. And this image, I'm gonna go to my sprites, our blank image that we created. I'm gonna assign that. This is gonna be filled. Let's choose a green color for it. So it is going to be horizontal and something like this. And let me just make it like a bar. Put these values to 0, and that is it. So we can determine it by changing the value of this. So that's it. Let's go and assign it, but before that I'm gonna change this to bar and assign that here. And of course we need a button, so we have a close button for our panel up here. Let's just use that. Copy that, paste it here and drag it something like that, set it to 0, and that is going to be removing the train. So that is it. And we could bring the title a little down. Of course, we are going to use an icon for our units and buildings later, but for now I'm just going to use a text to see what is what. So also let's assign the button and apply all the changes, and let's just delete that. Okay, here in the elements I am gonna close everything and save it. Now let's check this out. Whenever we are clicking on that remove button, this is going to be called, which is a package is going to be sent to the server. So let's go to the server and receive that package. Here in the terminal we are receiving the database ID. If you check this out, we are sending the database ID here. So here we are going to receive it, and then we're gonna pass it to the database to process it. So let me open a space for it, and here in my draft I've already created some functions. Here it is, cancel train unit and cancel train unit async. I'm just gonna copy those two and bring it here. Let's paste it, and here in the terminal I am going to call cancel train unit, and it is going to take a client and a database ID. So here we go, cancel train unit. It's gonna create a package, it's gonna write the ID of cancel unit, it's gonna get the account ID and pass that account ID and database ID to cancel train unit and waits for the response, and after it receives the response it's gonna send it to the client. So what is this cancel unit? It's gonna delete from units where ID equals to 0, which is our database ID, and account ID equals to 1, which is that account ID, and already of course it's less or equal than 0. So let's actually give you an explanation about this already. So what it does, let's go to the units. Here in the structure we have two columns. The first one is trained and ready. Both of these by default are 0. So whenever you insert into the units, both of these two values are 0. Whenever the time passes, okay, there's a certain time which this unit is going to be trained. During that time, let's say 10 seconds. When that 10 seconds gets finished, we're gonna set this train to 1. Which means the unit has been trained, but it hasn't been assigned to an army camp yet, which means the ready is still 0, and we're not gonna set this to 1 until some space gets freed up in any of our army camps, and whenever we have space on the army camp for it, then we're gonna set this ready to 1. So if you have a unit in our units table and the trained is 1 and ready is 1 also, then that unit is ready to participate in a battle and we can use it in our battles. Otherwise, it's not been trained. Well, actually, even if it's been trained, it's still in the barracks, haven't been assigned to an army camp. Okay, so those two values are for that. So let's go back to the server. So here we go, we are created those two as well. Now let's go back to the client here in the UI unit. So whenever the player starts the game, the first thing we're gonna do, we're gonna get a certain data from our server. So let's go to the data, and here I'm gonna create another class. And I'm gonna name it initialization data. And here I'm gonna create a public long called account ID, and also create a list of server units. And I'm just gonna copy this and bring it to our server as well. In the data, I'm just gonna paste it somewhere. And here in the database, in the authenticate player, let's go up here and find it. Well, instead of a long, we're gonna return a data dot initialization data. So let me just copy that and paste it here. And the same thing, well, let's find it, here it is. So this is going to be initialization data equals to new initialization data. So let me copy this. This is going to be initialization data dot account ID. The same thing here. And we're just gonna return the initialization data at the end. And at the end of the function, we're just gonna say right before we close the connection, we're gonna say initialization data dot server units equals to get server units, and we're gonna pass the connection, and that's it. And up there I am going to say data dot initialization data, let's name it auth equals to that. This is going to be auth dot account ID, and we need to serialize that. Let me just use something. Here it is, we have a similar here. So it is going to be, let's just paste it here. This is going to be auth data equals to auth, and this is going to be initialization data. At the end we're gonna write auth data as in a string, and we're gonna return it. So let's go back to the player, and here in the receive packet in the player, whenever we are receiving an auth, we're gonna do something similar than this. Let me just copy paste it, and also something like that. It is going to be auth data, and we're gonna say initialization data, and this is actually going to be, let's create a variable for it. I'm gonna say initialization data. Up here it is going to be public initialization data equals to new initialization data, and this initialization data equals to that. Let's go to the UI train and let's use the draft. Actually, here it is. I'm just going to create the initialize function, and let me copy that, bring it here in the UI train, and I'm gonna paste it here. Of course we need a list of UI training units and UI units. Let me just paste it here. We have two lists. The second one is going to be assigned in the inspector by us, but the other one is going to be assigned automatically, so we don't have to do anything for that. But for this one, let me go to the inspector, but before we do that, let's go to the initialization data, and this is going to be server units. This is going to be server units. The same thing here. Here in the UI unit, we need an initialize, so let's do that as well. Here it is. I am just gonna copy that, bring it here, and let's paste it. So instead of have units text, I'm just gonna say resources text, and we also need an ID here. So let's check this out. Let me just copy everything and bring it to the UI unit. That is going to be the ID. This is gonna be the button which is going to be clicked to send the train request. This is the amount of units you have, and this is the amount of resources you need to train this unit. So whenever this initialize is getting called, it's gonna pass a unit, and based on that unit required gold, elixir, or gems, we're gonna assign the value of this text. So that is that. Let me save this. And here in the UI train, this initialize is going to be called only once, and it's gonna loop through this list of UI units, which we are going to assign here in our canvas train. Let me enable this. Here in the units, content. So let me select the train. This is UI units, which is going to be a barbarian and an archer for now. So, and let's click on this barbarian. We have a button which already been assigned. We have a have count, and we need the required resources. So the same thing for the archer. I'm gonna duplicate this, name it resources, bring it up here. Of course, I'm not very comfortable with the Text Mesh Pro, but let's say we have no choice. That's it. And now we need to disable that. And let's check this out. So here in the UI train, we brought initialize. Let's see what else we have. Here in the UI train, let me just copy those, bring it here. So it is going to be is open, which is the indication of if this panel is open or not. And we can do that in the set status. We're just gonna say is open equals to status. If it is true, then this panel is open, otherwise it's not open. So that's that. Then we're gonna create a clear training items. It's gonna loop through all of them and delete every single one of them. So let's see what else we have. Here in the awake function, we are assigning those values. We already have that. We already have the initialize. Yes, and what else? We are needing to copy the sync, this one and this one. And let me copy that, bring it, let's say down here. And also let's go and copy the contents of set status. Well, actually, let's bring it all along with this update training list. So let's go and find our set status. gonna replace it. So what this does, let's go through with them one by one. So whenever we set the status to true, well, actually we are setting the status to anything. The first thing, we're gonna clear the list. If the status is true, we're gonna do a sync. And let me just close that. What is a sync? Let's go here. First of all, we're gonna loop through all our units and we're gonna initiate the sync method in them. So UI unit should have a sync. Let's bring the sync. Well, here it is, UI unit sync. Go to the UI unit and paste it here. So what this sync does, it is going to create a count, then it's going to loop through all the units in the player instance.data, and if it has the same ID and it is ready, then it's going to add it to the count and it's going to say have count equals to that. And whenever we set this have count, it is going to set this count to the value, and of course it's going to update the text of how many we have. So that's it. So here in the UI train, the first thing we're gonna do with the sync, we're gonna update all of those. Then we're gonna loop through our training items, and if it is not null, then we're gonna check to see if we have that training unit. The unit is currently being training in our units. So if we have that, we're gonna check the status of that. If we don't have it, we're gonna remove it from the list. Okay. If it is null, we're also going to remove it. And if it is in our units list and the ready of it is true, then it's been trained and we don't need to show it in our training list. So we're gonna also remove that in that case. And at the end, we're gonna call this update train list. Let's check this out. Here it is. So it's gonna loop through all the units, and if that unit is not ready, it checks to see if it exists in the training list. If it does not exist, then it's gonna instantiate it and add it to the list. So it's gonna say unit equals to instantiate the train prefab, train grid, and it's gonna initialize it using that and add it to this list. And at the end, it's gonna reset the training items index, which is going to loop through all the training items and assign the index to the correct index. So let's go to the UI unit. Yes, everything apparently works fine. UI training units, and let me uncomment these two. And let's go to the player here in the receive packet. Well, actually here in the sync data, here at the end of it, we're gonna check to see if UI train dot instance dot is open. If it is open, then we're gonna say UI train dot instance dot sync. Now let's go back to the server, and here in the database I need to add another update. Well, we have an error. Let's see where it is. Here in the authenticate player, yes, we need to change all of those to initialization data.account ID. Okay. That is going to fix that, and we also need to copy a function. Let's check out the draft. Here it is, general update training. Let me copy that, bring it here. So it is going to run 3 MySQL queries, and it's basically changing the time of the training. And whenever a unit is ready, it's gonna set the ready value to 1 for it. It is very complicated. It actually took me a while to write this. It's very long, and if you are familiar with MySQL, you can take a look at it. It's honestly, it's a little hard to explain. So basically what it does, it's gonna add the delta time to this train time, every time it's being called, and whenever the trained time is gonna reach this specific time that is required to train that unit, it's gonna set this value to 1. And whenever you set this value to 1, it starts checking the army camps to see if there's a space available, and if it's available, it's gonna set this to 1. So all of this, what I said, it's gonna happen using this 3 SQL queries. And we can call this here in the general update. Well, let's find it. Here, general update async. So before we close this, I'm gonna call it general update unit training, and pass the connection and delta time. So let's cast this as a float. Okay, here we go. And now we need to make one more change here in the get buildings by global ID. So whenever we call this, we are saying select level and global ID from buildings, but we also need to get the capacity as well. So to do that, we need to left join the server buildings. And we're gonna do that on buildings.globalid equals to server buildings.globalid. And I'm just gonna copy that and say and paste it one more time. And it is going to be level equals to level. And instead of those values, let me copy that. It's going to be building.globalid equals to that, and building.accountid equals to that. This is going to be building.id, building.globalid, and server buildings.capacity. And here I'm just gonna add another one saying capacity. And we could also add the other parameters as well, but we're gonna do that later if we need them. And let's say this is going to be server buildings. Okay, here we go. And the same thing here, server buildings.level. Okay, so let me start the server. And now let's play the game. So let's go and try to train a unit. Here we go. Let's train another one. Okay, here we go. They are in a list. I can remove as many as I want. And as you can see, the number here is increasing, but not immediately. We can fix that later. But we can add as many units to the list and train them. So let me add a few here. Okay. And let me close that. They are being trained right now. So let me stop this. Let's go to the client, and here in the player, whenever we are receiving those requests, well, let me see here in the player receive, we have a receive response for train and a response for cancel train. And this is also going to receive a integer. Let me just copy it, paste it here. And if this response equals to 1, let's rush the sync request. And of course, make sure here in the database, in the server buildings, let's go to the army camps and barracks. Here, army camps, find the capacity and make sure to set proper values for the capacity of these buildings, for army camp or barracks. So for now I just set the army caps to 20 and barracks to 40. For example, if we change this to 5, then 5 units at the same time can be trained, nothing more than that. So let's go back and play this, and let's go to our training. We have 12 of these and 8 of that. So let me train this, and as you can see I cannot train more than 5. Of course something weird is happening, but we can fix that later. So this is basically it, and let's go and check out the database here in the units. We can see that there are units has been trained for this account ID, and they are ready for battle right now. So far so good. Of course the video got very long, so I'm gonna leave the rest of it for the next video. So please don't forget to like and subscribe, and remember the source code is in the description just in case you wanna download it. Until next time, have fun and thanks for watching.